It's always a bit of a boring one at Monaco, but we have some brilliant storylines that seem to be developing along this 2024 season. Charles Leclerc has taken his first win in his hometown of Monaco, but this weekend has not been all plain sailing for all of the teams. There's been some big problems throughout the likes of Red Bull, and even Haas have suffered their own technical infringements. Shall we get a look into the full race? Let's talk about each team and their drivers. So we're going to start off with, obviously, the best team on the day, in my opinion, in being Ferrari. Charles Leclerc, what an excellent performance he has put up this weekend. And I think we all know at Monaco that when it comes to the race, unless there is big accidents or big mistakes, nothing really changes. We all know that. Now, Charles Leclerc managed this race brilliantly, and even after a big smash on lap one between Sergio Perez and the two Haas drivers, which we'll get into a little bit later on, Charles was able to go through completely unscathed. From start to finish, he handled it really well, managed his tyres really well after the red flag, and he came home victorious, which absolutely massive performance for him to win at home with all the opportunities he's had in the past. I think it was just perfect timing for him. And Carlos Sainz did a feature with Naomi Schiff for Sky Sports F1, and he said it's about time Charles wins, and I think we can all agree that Charles deserves this. What an excellent performance he's put in so far this season and over the past few months as well, heading back into the back end of last season too. And he came away victorious. He took pole position with a fairly sizable gap in comparison to everybody else, to Oscar Piastri. I think it was around 0.2 of a second, which I think Charles Leclerc did really well. And then going on to Carlos Sainz, and I think it's about time Carlos Sainz backed up Charles Leclerc for once. It always seems to be that on the races where Ferrari have pace, Sainz ends up ahead some way, shape, size or form. And this time it was not the case, and Carlos Sainz ended up behind, qualifying in P3. He finished the race on the podium in third place too, 7.5 seconds behind. And I think what we need to acknowledge from this race, and especially from these Ferrari drivers, is they managed the gaps really well. And I think Charles Leclerc, there was points during this race where every driver on the grid was lapping like 4 or 5 seconds off where they could lap if it was a race where they needed to push. And I think Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz in 1 and 3 managed those gaps brilliantly. Like Carlos would drop back to manage, and then Charles would sort of back Oscar back into Carlos, and then Charles would take off. Oscar would obviously follow, and Carlos would go as well. But obviously at Monaco, it's quite difficult to overtake. I think we only actually saw 4 or 5 overtakes for position, but I think absolutely massive performance from Ferrari. With every week that goes by, and the news that comes out of Mercedes every week, it's looking like Lewis Hamilton has made a brilliant decision to move over to Ferrari for 2025. And let's see what Ferrari can do, because obviously they're closing in on Red Bull now in the constructors' standings. Let's see, can we have a constructors battle on our hands? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. There's another team who, if you have not done so already, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below or in this top corner to stay tuned for all my latest Formula 1 content. We're going to be doing weekly videos on this channel. Every race review will come out on a Monday, and every race preview will come out on a Wednesday. And weeks where there isn't a race, we're going to integrate a news segment, and we're going to talk all about the latest news of Formula 1. So this week coming up on Wednesday, we'll do a Formula 1 news video just to keep you up to date with what's going off. Then next week we'll have a preview and news, and then the following week we'll have the race review from Canada, and then we'll have preview and news on the Wednesday. So do make sure you hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for all my latest content on here. If you are interested in football, go over and check out my football YouTube channel. You'll see the name down below on the ticker, so do make sure you go and check that one out, and I'll catch you in the next part of this video. Just going through, I've just realised I've missed out a big important part of this race. And at the start of the race, Carlos Sainz would have felt his race was over. He went through the first corner, made contact with Oscar Piastri, and got a puncture. And heading round turn 2, turn 3, he couldn't stop the car, and he locked up, just went straight on. Didn't hit a barrier, but was realistically, right back down. I think it would have been P16 at the time, maybe P17. And realistically, at that point, race is over. They're much harder for Charles Leclerc to manage the race, but Carlos Sainz got really, really lucky with how they handled the red flag situation, which I'll get onto when we talk about Sergio Perez and Red Bull, because he got really lucky with the starting order that they put back on because they hadn't hit enough timing boards as an entire grid, which for me, I think they've got mini sectors. They know where everybody's lined up on the grid, and I think that's something which needs to be looked at in future, and even the tyre changes need to be looked at. But Carlos Sainz will feel like a lucky boy to restart the race in P3, who could be joining that fight as well, and that is the McLarens of Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. And they both put in some fairly decent qualifying session and a fairly good race as well. Obviously, Lando Norris qualifying in P4, finishing P4, 8.65 seconds off the pace. And Oscar Piastri qualifying P2, finishing P2. Another podium for him. His first as an honorary Leclerc, just 7.15 seconds behind. And I think Oscar got to the point where he realised that he wasn't going to be able to overtake Charles unless he hit a wall or made a massive error. So he sort of just managed his own race to close in. And there was one point where Charles really checked out. He got to about, I think it was about 9.5 seconds at its peak, the gap. And then he just got to a point where he was like, right, I've done, I'm checked out here. And I think the two McLarens put in a really good performance throughout the weekend, throughout qualifying. And Oscar Piastri, in my opinion, over recent weeks has really come into his own. Got really unlucky in Miami. He pitted I think it was a lap before the safety car. Otherwise, that would have been his first win of the season and first win of his Formula One career. You've obviously then got Imola, where the blocking incident where he lost 3 places from his qualifying place, where he would have started second on the grid, which obviously Lando Norris then ended up starting second. So these two drivers are really starting to come into their own, and Lando Norris is getting closer to his prime. Oscar Piastri is developing quite well, and these two could be a force to be reckoned with if McLaren do get a car capable of fighting not just for the constructors but even the Drivers' Championship too. And while we're talking about the constructors, the big discussion has to be around Red Bull, because how much longer are they going to put up with Perez stinkers? Because he's had a couple now, and it's really brought the McLarens and the Ferraris back into the mix, which if you'd have told me before Miami that these teams would be in the mix, I probably would have told you were lying. And realistically, I think a lot of people think that way. But if we do now move over to the Mercedes 2 of Lewis Hamilton and George Russell. Now, there's a lot to talk about with Mercedes because Lewis Hamilton came out after qualifying saying that he knows every weekend he's going to lose 2/10 going into qualifying. And what was he on about? Now, was he on about the front wing update? I personally don't know. I don't think so, because would that front wing have made much of a difference? I don't think so. George was only 0.08, I think, in qualifying ahead, qualifying in P5 compared to P7. But obviously, there's something going on at Mercedes which Lewis isn't quite liking. And obviously, some people are going to say that he's just whinging, crying, whatever. But for me, I completely understand the sort of things he's talking about. We've seen it in the past with drivers moving on, that they obviously don't get any preferential treatment at any point. They don't get the help that other drivers get. And I think there was a big moment in the race today where Lewis Hamilton picked up, I think it was like a 38.5 second gap on Yuki Tsunoda behind. So he had plenty of time to box, and Mercedes boxed in with the intention, in my opinion, obviously, of getting Max to box so that then Lewis could essentially pit to overtake. And on the outlap, Bono comes on the radio. If I can find the clip, I'll put it on the screen, but I'll just explain it at the moment. And Bono came on the radio and said outlap normal, and Lewis came out, I think it was like the lap after, when Max had boxed and come back out and was just ahead of Lewis. And Lewis obviously at that point wasn't very happy because he could have probably gone quicker and been ahead of Max Verstappen had they told him it was outlap critical. And I think they're making some big errors at Mercedes at the minute, and that's just one of them. There's numerous others going on with like the times they send them out in qualifying and things like that. I think at Monaco, sending you out of qualifying, you've essentially just got to go out and go. Just keep putting laps in, because eventually the track greens up and you end up quicker. And obviously it's one of those races. Both drivers finished where they started, 14.9 seconds behind the leaders for Lewis Hamilton, 13.3 for George Russell. Now, well, we've spoke about Mercedes. It's now time to look at the Red Bulls of Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez. And is this their annual stinker? I think so. Now, obviously, they didn't win the race in Miami. In Australia, they had some issues as well and didn't win that race. But this weekend, it just seems to keep going. These issues seem to keep going, and Red Bull are under pressure, and they seem to be falling for the pressure. Qualifying just in P6 for Max Verstappen as he hits the wall. Poor for me. I'm not saying he'd have qualified on pole even without hitting the wall. I think Leclerc was in a league of his own this weekend, and I do think the Red Bulls probably should have been where the McLarens were, in my opinion. And obviously, you look at Sergio Perez qualifying in P16, well, it was P18, then ended up P16 because of the technical infringements for Haas. And for me, I just think Max Verstappen, poor showing in qualifying, unable to get the car in the window that he wanted it throughout practice. And I think we've seen that a lot recently with the Red Bulls. Obviously had issues in Miami, then they had issues in Imola, and now issues again in Monaco. And Sergio Perez has hit his annual stinkers, in my opinion. It always seems to begin when they head towards the European sequence of races. Now, obviously, qualified poorly at Imola, poorly again at Monaco. How's he going to get on at Canada? I know Canada is North America, but it's within the European section. So for me, Sergio Perez has really got to tighten up those laces and put that helmet back on. He's got to put in a good performance in the next race, because otherwise he could find some real problems with his contract heading into next season, because at some point Red Bull are going to realise that he's not the rear gunner that they need, because you need someone who can be up the front all the time, and Sergio Perez is certainly not doing that. Now, Max Verstappen finished the race in P6, 13.853 seconds behind the leader, and I think put in a fairly decent performance. It's Monaco. If I see any race pace graphs, charts or anything going around, it's absolutely stupid, because nobody was on the pace today. Everybody was managing. Everybody was just sort of, if I stay within this amount of time and stay within this part of the track, no one can overtake me. And that's something which I think needs to be looked at in future for Monaco. Maybe make it a mandatory 2 or 3 stop race. You have to run every dry compound, or if it's a wet race, obviously then you can't really make that decision. But for me, they need to make some changes about Monaco. Maybe even specific cars for Monaco that are lighter, narrower, and not as heavy, so that you can actually overtake on these tracks. Because ultimately, it's not very good at Monaco at the moment. It's a bit of a bore fest, really, unless you have the big accidents. Now, obviously, you will have probably seen the accident with Sergio Perez. I'll put a clip of it on screen now. It just wasn't a great situation for Sergio Perez, was it? He put himself in a good place, and Magnussen just really tried to hang one down that up the hill, and it just didn't work out well, and took out both Magnussen and Hülkenberg, which ended up with them DNFing in the race, and just isn't very good, really, is it? But now we get onto the Aston Martins of Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll. Alonso qualifying in P13. Originally, it was a little bit further back than that, but the technical infringements with the Haas cars budged him forward twice. Same with Lance Stroll. He qualified in P13, but ended up starting in P12 because of the 2 Haas cars. but both didn't really make an impression in the race, which is quite difficult in this Monaco race. Obviously, Fernando Alonso finishing P11, Lance Stroll finishing P14, both drivers 2 laps down. Now, Fernando Alonso at one point backed up the grid so that Lance Stroll could box, and then Lance Stroll picked up a puncture, and unfortunately that took him out of the running for any points. And I think at the point of Lance Stroll getting the punch, he was quite far ahead. Well, he was ahead of Fernando Alonso, and ultimately that second pit stop really sort of ruined his race. And there's not really much to talk about with these two, apart from the fact of Lance Stroll has now matched Fernando Alonso in qualifying. But other than that, there's not really a lot good going on for Aston Martin. They've really gone backwards since this time last year, when Fernando Alonso could have won the Monaco GP last year, but strategy failure ruined it in the end, and ultimately they've gone backwards since this time last year. And in my opinion, I think they're going to continue to go backwards, because I don't think they understand the car they've got underneath them. It was brilliant to start off with a year ago, but not anymore. And now we take a look at the Visa Cash App Racing Bulls buy one get one free, as James Vowles said, and Yuki Tsunoda with another excellent performance, qualifying in P8, finishing the race in P8, a lap down. He did, in my opinion, a really impressive job. He really backed up the pack, and realistically, he was the reason we had sort of the really fast laps from Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton towards the end, because him backing up the likes of Alex Albon and everyone behind Albon was a brilliant strategy, really, for Yuki Tsunoda to make it all the way to the end. Daniel Ricciardo qualifying in P11, finishing the race in P12, 2 laps down on everybody else. But it's just one of those for me, and you've got to feel a little bit for the likes of Daniel Ricciardo and Yuki Tsunoda, because they're nowhere near the likes of Mercedes, McLaren, Ferrari, Red Bull, but they're also quite close to everybody else. So although they're probably the quickest in the bunch, they've just not quite got enough to get away from the bunch. And obviously we'll hope with upgrades that changes as the weeks and months go on of this season. But it's going to be a long back end of the season, and Yuki Tsunoda's done an excellent job this season to make sure they pick up some points. Daniel Ricciardo obviously had a really good sprint race a few races ago. It's going to be really interesting to see how the back end of this team's season goes on. And then we take a look into the Williams. Alex Albon qualified P9, finished P9, standard procedure for Monaco, as I've said for a lot of these. Same with Logan Sargent. Difficult race to overtake, difficult race to get overtaken. And realistically, there's not really a lot to say about these two drivers. Both managed really well. Albon probably had a lot more pace underneath him, but obviously Tsunoda doing his job. Obviously backed Albon right the way back up, and wasn't able to break away. And that's just something that happens at Monaco. And I said it in my preview, you can drive 4 or 5 seconds off the pace, and ultimately it does not really matter. But it is going to be interesting to see how it goes over the next few weeks and months for Williams. Obviously, they've got to have some big upgrades coming at some point, and hopefully that'll bring them closer to the likes of Visa Cash App, and hopefully push both of those teams closer up towards the back of the Mercedes team at the end of the season. Now we look at Alpine, and there's got to be a big discussion around these, because Esteban Ocon ruined his race on lap 1, trying to overtake Pierre Gasly in a corner where you don't really try and overtake your teammate, especially not on lap 1. And Bruno Famin, the Alpine, is he team principal? I'm not quite sure what his actual title is. Wasn't very happy. He says decisions have got to be made, and both of these drivers' contracts are up at the end of the season, and Gasly's picked up a point today, a lap down on the rest of the field, but he's picked up a point. Esteban Ocon ruined his race, and a potential chance at double points. And obviously it probably would have been 10th and 11th, but you never know what could have happened if Ocon was in and around the field, how they could have played strategies and things like that. And it's unfortunate for Alpine, and obviously you saw the academy drivers of Doohan and Gabriel Mini smiling to themselves during the red flag period after the big crash with Sergio Perez. And is there something coming for them? Obviously, Alpine are rumoured to be looking at Jack Doohan and Mick Schumacher for next season. Obviously, Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon, both drivers are really looking for a way out. Gasly's rumoured to be in for the likes of the Haas seat. Esteban Ocon also rumoured to be a name in the hat for the Haas, Williams, and even the Mercedes seat. So it will be interesting to see how it plays out over the next few months. Silly season really has kicked off. And then Sauber, Stake, whatever you want to call them, gained places in the race as a result of 4 cars going out of the race. Qualified P17, finished the race in 13th for Bottas, 2 laps down. Guan Yu Zhou qualified P18, finished the race in P16, 2 laps down. Not really much to say on these. They've bought some upgrades, but in qualifying, I think they were half a second down on the next team ahead of them. And in race trim, you can't really judge any team, in my opinion. I've said it a few times in this. You just can't judge them. Disaster weekend for Haas as both drivers were disqualified from qualifying for technical infringements regarding their new rear wing. It's an upgraded part and they tested it in the wrong part, and it turned out that it was opening too much. We saw back in Brazil 2021, Lewis Hamilton got disqualified for that, and it has happened again to these 2 drivers. So they both took pit lane starts and were out within the first 500 metres of the race. After Kevin Magnussen tried to hang on around the outside of Sergio Perez, took Perez out, which then took Hülkenberg out. Guan Yu Zhou was lucky to get away unscathed. Probably punctured his tyres, but obviously we had the red flag, so it didn't really matter in the end. But disappointing for these drivers. I thought they had some quite decent pace and they were in and around it. I think they qualified actually something like P12 and 15, I want to say. But obviously both drivers disqualified from that, so it doesn't really matter. Be interesting to see how they get on in the next race weekend. Obviously, Kevin Magnussen has got a lot to prove. He's had some big critics recently, and Nico Hülkenberg has obviously sorted himself out an opportunity at Audi. Well, Sauber, Audi for next season and the years following. So it's going to be interesting to see how Haas finish off this season. So that is the race. And for me, I just thought it was a poor one. I don't think it was very good. Obviously, Monaco being Monaco, you sort of anticipate that. We obviously had the big crash early on in the race, which was anticipated. It was something which I sort of said the race needed, but I think it happened a bit too early. We needed sort of that accident like 20 or 30 laps into the race, and more of a safety car accident than a red flag accident. But it's just one of those. Sergio Perez, again, has got a lot to prove over the next few weeks and months of this season, because I am in the position where I don't think he should have his contract renewed. I think he's got a long way to go before he deserves a contract extension at Red Bull. And I think in the end this season, I don't think Red Bull are going to win the Constructors. I think Max will win the Drivers' Championship, but I think it'll either be Ferrari or McLaren who end up winning the Constructors, because they are just so close to each other when it comes to teammate pairings. And Charles and Carlos are always quite close, and Oscar and Lando are quite close. And we saw last season that consistency from at least one driver can boost you up the standings. We saw it with Mercedes, with Lewis Hamilton. What a season he had last year. And it's one of those. I think Lewis Hamilton's checked out for 2024. He's said a few things in interviews, and for me, it just feels like he's checked out for 2024, just ticking off side quests as the season goes on, and we'll see how that ends up. But I do think Ferrari and McLaren are probably going to be the ones battling it out for those constructors' titles. For me, I don't think Red Bull are really going to be in with a shot if Sergio Perez carries on with this form. So we will have to see what happens going into, I think it's Canada next. I will try and post a video next week with whatever's going on in the F1 world. I'll try and keep up to date with everything, and we'll do a weekly video on the channel talking about that. We'll preview every race on a Wednesday, and we'll post the reviews on Mondays, but we'll try and stick to every Wednesday for previews and news as the season goes on. So do make sure you hit that subscribe button and stay tuned to the channel, and I'll catch you in my next video. Make sure to go and find me on TikTok, pictured here, and Twitter, pictured here. These are the places where I'll keep you all up to date with all my upcoming videos and my thoughts and feelings around the Formula 1 and football weekend.